I never thought a simple hobby could turn into a war. Fishing had been my escape since I was a kid. The stillness of the water, the patience it demanded, and the quiet reward of pulling in a catch. It was the one thing that calmed my nerves after long work days. When I moved into my new home, the lake behind my property wasn't just a selling point. It was the dream. Clear water stretched out just beyond my yard, shimmering under the sun in summer and cloaked in mist during the colder mornings. To me, it was priceless. The Homeowners Association, or HOA, had different plans. From the moment I moved in, they treated the lake like their trophy. It was technically community property, but my yard directly backed onto it, and unlike most of the neighborhood, I had direct, private access. While others had to walk to the designated community dock, I could simply stroll out my back gate and cast my line. That didn't sit well with them. The HOA was run by a handful of residents who loved control more than anything else. They decided when lawns were too long, when trash cans weren't hidden properly, and when paint colors were not within aesthetic guidelines. I could tolerate most of that nonsense. But when they noticed I was fishing regularly, sometimes even with friends, they began circling like vultures. At first, it was small warnings tucked into my mailbox. Reminder, lake access is for all residents. Please ensure you are not overusing the common resource. Then came the emails. Concerns have been raised that you are monopolizing the lake. Fishing should be done from the community dock, not private yards. I ignored most of it. Fishing in my own backyard seemed harmless. I wasn't disturbing anyone, I wasn't leaving trash, and I wasn't breaking any written rules. In fact, when I reviewed the HOA bylaws, there wasn't a single clause that prohibited fishing from private access points. Still, I could feel the tension building. The turning point came at a monthly HOA meeting, where one board member suggested restricting fishing altogether to preserve the natural balance of the lake. I knew what that meant. They didn't want to preserve anything, they just wanted to control me. Weeks passed, and the warnings escalated into threats. Further violations may result in fines. They had no legal ground, but the HOA thrived on intimidation. They wanted me to cave, to use the community dock like everyone else, to fall in line. But I didn't. I refused. Fishing was my right, and I wasn't going to let a group of petty tyrants strip that away. Then, one morning, everything changed. I woke early before dawn, as I often did when I wanted peace on the water. The mist clung to the lake, and the air was cool and still. I grabbed my tackle box, poured coffee into a thermos, and headed out back. But as I approached the waterline, I froze. The lake, once clear and glassy, had turned murky and foul. A chemical stench rose from it, burning my nose. The surface shimmered with a strange, oily film, reflecting rainbow streaks under the weak sunrise. Dead fish floated belly up near the bank. My stomach sank. This wasn't natural. This wasn't algae or seasonal change. Someone had poisoned the lake. At first, I thought maybe it was an accident. A nearby farm runoff, a broken septic line, some sort of spill. But as the days went on, it became undeniable. The water grew worse, not better. Frogs, turtles, and birds began disappearing. The stench intensified until even sitting outside on the porch was unbearable. The lake was dead, or dying, and the timing was too perfect. I had been openly defiant against the HOA. I had made it clear I wouldn't back down. And then, suddenly, the lake, the very thing they hated me using, was destroyed. My gut screamed that they were behind it. I brought it up to the HOA immediately, demanding answers. Their response was infuriating. They shrugged. They claimed they hadn't noticed. They insisted nothing unusual had been reported. But their smirks, their dismissive tone, and their lack of concern told me everything I needed to know. I began investigating on my own. I asked neighbors if they noticed anything suspicious. A few admitted they'd seen men working near the shore at night, wearing reflective vests and hauling containers. Others said they thought the HOA had treated the water for weeds or mosquitoes. That was the first time I realized the HOA had not only poisoned my hobby, they had poisoned their own water supply. Because here's the thing about that lake. It wasn't just for looks. It wasn't just for recreation. The lake was tied into the neighborhood's irrigation system and groundwater source. For years, the HOA had boasted about how self-sufficient the community was, pulling from its own lake-fed wells instead of relying heavily on city water. That had been part of the sales pitch when I bought my house, and now, in their obsession to stop me from fishing, they had poisoned the very thing that sustained them. At first, it was only the smell and the sight of dead fish. But within weeks, homeowners began complaining of cloudy tap water. A strange metallic taste crept into the drinking supply. Lawns watered from the irrigation system began turning brown instead of green. Pets started getting sick. The HOA scrambled to cover it up, telling residents it was a seasonal bloom and completely normal. But panic was spreading. I sat on my porch, watching the chaos unfold, and felt a strange mix of rage and satisfaction. They had gone too far, and now they were reaping what they had sown. The poisoned lake had become more than just a ruined fishing spot. It had become the neighborhood's nightmare. And I wasn't done yet, because if they thought I was going to sit quietly while they destroyed everything just to spite me, they had another thing coming. I was going to uncover the truth. I was going to expose them, and I was going to make sure every single one of those board members paid for what they had done. But little did I know, the battle was only just beginning. When the lake first turned toxic, most of the neighborhood was in denial. People didn't want to believe that the serene, picturesque centerpiece of their community could be ruined so quickly. The HOA encouraged that denial, pushing the narrative that it was just a seasonal issue, maybe a harmless algae bloom or a natural turnover in the water. They circulated newsletters full of vague explanations and reassurances, promising that the water was being monitored. But denial only works for so long. As the weeks stretched on, the damage became impossible to ignore. The oily sheen that coated the lake didn't go away. The smell grew worse, seeping into homes nearest the waterline. The dead fish weren't just isolated cases anymore. They piled up in clusters along the shore, rotting in the sun until maintenance crews were forced to quietly collect them at night. Neighbors who once walked their dogs by the water now avoided the area altogether. Children who used to ride their bikes to the community dock stayed indoors. What had been the neighborhood's pride was now a festering eyesore. Behind closed doors, the HOA was panicking. I knew this because they slipped up. During one of their so-called emergency board meetings, held in the clubhouse, they had forgotten that the walls were thin. From my porch, I could hear raised voices. Phrases like, "We can't let this get out," and "the tests will ruin us," drifted through the evening air. They weren't trying to fix the lake, they were trying to cover up their tracks. The more I listened, the clearer it became. The HOA had authorized treatments for the water under the guise of pest control. They claimed it was necessary to keep mosquito populations down and to control invasive plants along the shoreline. But the chemical cocktail they dumped into the lake had gone far beyond that. Either they miscalculated or they simply didn't care what the consequences would be, and now the poison was spreading through the entire system. The most ironic part was that they had tried to target me. Their obsession with stopping my fishing had blinded them. They thought that by killing off the fish or making the water inhospitable, I'd give up and fall in line. Instead, they had poisoned themselves and every other resident in the process. At first, they tried to blame outsiders. In another newsletter, they suggested the lake may have been contaminated by unauthorized use. They hinted that people dumping waste or fertilizers might be responsible. It was an easy scapegoat designed to shift suspicion away from the HOA board. But it didn't hold up. Residents asked questions. Who would dump chemicals in the middle of the night? Why hadn't this happened in years past? Frustration began to bubble in the community. Parents worried about letting their kids drink the tap water. Gardeners watched their plants wither. Elderly residents complained of stomach issues, though the HOA insisted it was coincidental. The neighborhood Facebook group lit up daily with photos of the lake, the water supply, and angry posts demanding answers. The HOA responded with more threats than solutions. They sent out reminders about respectful communication and warned that spreading misinformation could result in fines. They even shut down the comments on their official social media page. But silencing people only made them more suspicious. I, meanwhile, kept gathering evidence. I collected water samples in jars, labeling them with dates. I photographed the fish kills, the rainbow sheen on the surface, and the black sludge that began forming near the storm drains feeding into the lake. I compiled everything into a digital folder, time-stamped and backed up. I knew eventually I would need proof, something undeniable. Then the real trouble began. The first signs were small. A neighbor across the street mentioned her tap water looked cloudy when she filled a glass. Another family said their dog had started vomiting after drinking from the sprinkler runoff. The HOA brushed it off as unrelated, but soon the complaints grew louder. Laundry came out of machines with odd stains. Showers carried a faint chemical odor. The metallic taste in the drinking water was impossible to ignore. The HOA panicked again. They sent out bottled water to a handful of residents closest to the lake, disguising it as a courtesy during maintenance. They quietly arranged for a contractor to test the wells, but when residents asked for the results, they were stonewalled. Confidential. Pending review. Nothing unusual found. I knew they were lying. One night, while walking near the clubhouse, I spotted a man in a hazmat-style suit unloading equipment from a van. He wasn't a landscaper. He wasn't pest control. He was a specialist, the kind you call when you're dealing with a serious environmental problem. I trailed him at a distance, watching as he collected samples and loaded them into a cooler. When I later checked the van's side panel, it bore the name of a private water testing company. The HOA wasn't just aware of the contamination. They were actively trying to hide how severe it had become. By this point, the neighborhood was fracturing. Half of the residents believed the HOA's story, clinging to the idea that things were under control. The other half whispered about lawsuits, about getting the city or the county involved. Meetings grew heated, with shouting matches between board members and furious homeowners. The once pristine, tight-knit community was unraveling, and all of it traced back to their obsession with me. Every time I walked past the clubhouse or attended a meeting, I could feel their glares. They knew I suspected them. They knew I was documenting everything. The HOA president in particular seemed rattled. Once confident and smug, she now looked nervous whenever residents pressed her with questions. She avoided eye contact with me entirely, but even in their panic, they underestimated just how much leverage I had, because I wasn't the only one paying attention. A few neighbors began confiding in me, slipping me information they overheard or documents they managed to get their hands on. One family admitted they had seen HOA board members unloading drums near the lake late at night, though they were too afraid to speak up. Another neighbor forwarded me an email chain where the board discussed treatment options and explicitly mentioned discouraging excessive fishing activity. That was the smoking gun. Not only had they poisoned the lake, but they had admitted on record that part of the reason was to stop me from fishing. The deeper the HOA dug into their cover-up, the deeper the hole became. Contractors were coming and going at odd hours. Trucks with unmarked barrels rolled into the neighborhood, unloading near the restricted maintenance shed. Rumors spread that the HOA was spending thousands of dollars from community funds on emergency services, all without resident approval. People began asking where their HOA dues were really going. The turning point came when a resident posted photos online of a water filter in their home clogged with black sludge. The post went viral, spreading far beyond the neighborhood Facebook group. Local news stations picked it up. Suddenly, reporters were calling, asking questions the HOA couldn't afford to answer. For the first time, I saw genuine fear on the faces of the board members. They had tried to silence me. They had tried to poison me out of my hobby. But now their own reckless plan had spiraled out of control, and the world outside our gates was beginning to notice, and I wasn't about to let them wriggle free, because if they thought this was bad, they hadn't seen anything yet. By the time the news story broke, the neighborhood had already been simmering like a pot about to boil over. The residents were restless, angry, and tired of the HOA's endless excuses. But the media attention changed everything. It was no longer just a private dispute between a handful of board members and the people they claimed to represent. Now outsiders were watching. Cameras were pointed at the gates, reporters were walking the sidewalks, and questions were being asked that the HOA couldn't dodge forever. The first article came from a small local paper, describing the mysterious contamination of a neighborhood lake and residents' growing concerns about their water supply. It featured photos of the dead fish, the oily sheen on the lake, and that now infamous image of a homeowner's clogged filter coated with black sludge. The HOA tried to downplay it, calling the coverage inaccurate and alarmist, but the damage was already done. Bigger outlets picked up the story. Soon, the lake was being described as a potential health hazard, and the HOA as negligent, secretive, and possibly corrupt. Neighbors who had once been passive or afraid to speak out suddenly found their voices. They began organizing outside of the HOA's control, gathering in living rooms and garages to discuss what was really happening. They compared notes about their water quality, shared screenshots of threatening HOA emails, and whispered about the board's strange behavior. For the first time, people weren't scared of fines or violations. They were furious. The anger was directed at the board, but it also circled back to me. Some residents blamed me outright. They said if I hadn't been fishing, none of this would have happened. Others defended me, arguing that the HOA had been unhinged long before I arrived. The divide was sharp, but one thing was certain: nobody trusted the board anymore. At the next monthly HOA meeting, the clubhouse was packed wall to wall. People who usually skipped these gatherings showed up in droves, arms crossed, faces set in grim determination. I arrived early, taking a seat near the back. I wanted to see how the board would try to spin things now that the community was against them. The president opened the meeting with her usual polished tone, but the cracks in her confidence were visible. Her voice wavered slightly as she tried to reassure everyone that independent testing was underway and that the situation was fully under control. But the crowd wasn't buying it. Residents began shouting over her, demanding real answers. One man held up a bottle of discolored tap water, shaking it for all to see. A woman in the front row read aloud a vet's report showing her dog's illness linked to contaminated irrigation runoff. The board looked cornered, their carefully rehearsed lines collapsing under the weight of real evidence and raw emotion. When one resident asked point-blank if chemicals had been dumped in the lake without proper permits, the silence that followed was deafening. The president stammered something about necessary treatments, but the crowd erupted. It was chaos. People shouted for resignations. Others threatened lawsuits. The board tried to gavel the meeting back into order, but it was like trying to stop a storm with bare hands. The anger was too great, the trust too broken. That night, the HOA lost control of the room, and they never truly got it back. In the days that followed, things escalated further. Residents started organizing petitions to remove board members. A group of volunteers began testing the water themselves, posting results online for all to see. The numbers were damning, dangerously high levels of toxins far above safe drinking standards. It was proof the HOA could no longer deny. The board responded with desperation. They doubled down on fines, issuing violation notices for petty infractions like trash bins visible from the street and improper mailbox decorations. It was a clear intimidation tactic, but instead of silencing people, it enraged them more. Neighbors posted the fines online, mocking the HOA for worrying about mailbox paint while their water supply was poisoned. The board also tried to paint themselves as victims. They claimed they were being harassed and unfairly targeted, but nobody was sympathetic. Even the residents who once defended them began to turn. The narrative was clear. The HOA had poisoned the lake, poisoned the water, and then lied about it to everyone's faces. As the neighborhood fractured, alliances shifted. People who had never spoken to me before began knocking on my door, asking what I knew. Some thanked me for standing up to the board. Others wanted advice on how to push back. It was strange. Suddenly, I wasn't just the guy who liked fishing. I had become a symbol of resistance, the person who had exposed the board's arrogance. But I wasn't naive. I knew the HOA wasn't done with me. One morning, I found a letter taped to my door. It wasn't the usual violation notice. This one was more personal. In bold letters, it read, "Cease all false claims or face legal action." They accused me of spreading lies that damaged the community's reputation and threatened to sue if I didn't stop. It was laughable. They had no ground to stand on, not with all the evidence piling up against them. Still, it showed their desperation. They wanted me quiet more than ever. What they didn't realize was that their threats only fueled me further. I kept documenting, kept collecting proof. Every photograph, every water sample, every whispered confession from neighbors, I archived it all. I knew the day was coming when the truth would burst wide open, and I wanted to be ready. Meanwhile, the physical signs of the poisoning were everywhere. The lake had become a wasteland. Once a place of beauty and calm, it now looked like something out of a nightmare. Black scum clung to the shoreline. The air smelled sharp and acrid, burning your nose if you stood too close. Ducks and geese that used to glide across the surface were gone, driven away, or dead. The silence around the water was eerie, broken only by the occasional splash of something rotting beneath. The community's mood matched the lake, ugly, toxic, and suffocating. Neighbors who once waved politely now gathered in tense groups, whispering about lawsuits, recalls, and emergency town halls. The sense of trust, the illusion of harmony, was gone forever. Then, the city got involved. The news coverage and resident complaints had finally triggered an official investigation. Trucks from the Environmental Health Department rolled into the neighborhood, their crews unloading equipment and setting up stations around the lake. They tested the water, the soil, even the wells. Their presence alone was enough to terrify the HOA. No amount of spin or intimidation could bury the results once the government was involved. The board tried to act cooperative, smiling for the cameras and pretending they had been the ones to call for help. But nobody believed them anymore. Residents stood behind the investigators, openly telling their stories, pointing fingers at the board and begging for accountability. For me, it was vindication. I had been saying it from the start. The HOA poisoned the lake. And now the evidence was about to prove it beyond any doubt. But vindication wasn't enough, because as much as I wanted to see the board humiliated, I wanted them held accountable, real accountability. Not just a slap on the wrist, but consequences they couldn't wiggle out of. The damage they had done went far beyond my fishing hobby. They had jeopardized the health and safety of everyone in the neighborhood. Pets had been harmed, gardens destroyed, property values tanked, and families left terrified to drink their own water. The board deserved to pay for that. The neighborhood was restless, but for the first time there was a glimmer of unity. Residents who had been divided were coming together with a single goal: to take down the HOA. Petitions turned into formal recall votes. Lawsuit discussions turned into actual meetings with lawyers. The investigation loomed over everything like a storm cloud, and people were ready for justice. The board, sensing the end, grew reckless. They tried one last desperate move, hinting that the contamination might not be reversible, that the entire neighborhood's value was doomed. It was a scare tactic, meant to make people cling to them as the only ones capable of fixing things. But it backfired. Residents saw through it, realizing that the very people claiming to save them were the ones who had created the disaster. And me? I stayed steady, documenting, collecting, and waiting, because I knew the storm was only just beginning to break. The lake was poisoned. The water was poisoned. The trust was poisoned, and now the HOA itself was about to be destroyed from the inside out. The day the official investigation results came back was the day everything changed. For weeks, the neighborhood had been buzzing with rumors, speculations, and theories about what was really in the water. People whispered about pesticides, industrial runoff, or even raw sewage. But when the Environmental Health Department posted their findings, there was no more guessing. It was all laid bare. And the truth was worse than most people had imagined. The lake was contaminated with high concentrations of chemicals typically used in commercial herbicides and algicides, far above any safe threshold. These weren't the kinds of compounds that just accidentally show up in a body of water. They had been deliberately introduced, dumped in large quantities, and left to fester. The report specifically mentioned that the contamination was consistent with improper or unregulated application of chemical treatments. In other words, someone had poisoned the lake. The report went further. It confirmed that the contamination had leached into the irrigation system and seeped into the shallow groundwater wells that supplied the neighborhood. While it hadn't fully penetrated the municipal water connection yet, The local health officials recommended an immediate do not drink advisory for all residents until further notice. The neighborhood exploded. Families who had been skeptical, who had believed the HOA's reassurances, suddenly realized they had been drinking and bathing in poisoned water for weeks. Parents were furious, worried about their children's health. Elderly residents panicked, demanding medical tests. Pets were rushed to vets. The sense of betrayal was absolute. The HOA board tried to spin it, but it was useless. They issued a statement claiming they had hired a contractor to treat the lake in good faith, and that the contamination was an unintended consequence. But the report contradicted that excuse. The levels of chemicals were too high, the application too sloppy. This wasn't the work of a professional contractor. It was the work of amateurs who had no idea what they were doing, and everyone knew exactly who those amateurs were, the board. I wasn't surprised. From the very first time I saw the lake turn foul, I knew the HOA had their fingerprints all over it. But now I finally had the confirmation I needed. The board hadn't just targeted me, they had endangered everyone. And now they couldn't hide behind vague excuses or intimidation letters. They were cornered. The investigation didn't stop at the contamination. City officials dug deeper, requesting financial records from the HOA to see how community funds were being used. That's when the second scandal broke wide open. Tens of thousands of dollars had been spent on maintenance with no clear documentation. The chemical purchases had been funneled through vague expense categories, often labeled as landscaping or pest control. Residents were furious. Their dues had been used to poison their own lake, to poison their own water supply, and to cover up the board's reckless obsession with control. The trust was gone, shattered beyond repair. The fallout was immediate. The HOA president resigned under pressure, but it wasn't enough. The rest of the board tried to hold on to power, insisting they had acted in the community's best interest. But residents weren't buying it. Petitions to recall the entire board gained traction overnight. Emergency meetings turned into shouting matches, with homeowners demanding resignations, refunds, and accountability. I watched it all unfold with a strange mix of satisfaction and disbelief. The same people who once glared at me for fishing in my own backyard were now screaming for the board's heads. The same neighbors who once muttered that I was stirring trouble now thanked me for gathering evidence. In their eyes, I wasn't just the stubborn fisherman anymore. I was the one who had seen through the lies from the start. But I wasn't celebrating yet, because I knew the HOA still had one card left to play. They tried to scapegoat me. In a desperate attempt to deflect blame, a letter went out to the entire community. It claimed that while the board had indeed authorized minimal treatments, the majority of the contamination was likely caused by unauthorized activity near the shoreline. Without saying my name directly, the implication was clear. They wanted people to think I had poisoned the lake myself. It was laughable. Insulting even. But in a community already on edge, even wild accusations had power. Some residents, fueled by fear, began whispering again. What if I had done it? What if I was the real problem all along? The board hoped those seeds of doubt would save them, but their plan backfired. Because I wasn't alone anymore. Neighbors who had seen the board sneaking around at night came forward. One man produced photos he had taken of barrels being unloaded near the maintenance shed. A woman shared a chain of emails where the board explicitly discussed targeting my fishing access. The evidence was overwhelming. The smear campaign crumbled within days. The board's desperation only made them look guiltier. They had spent months denying, lying, and threatening anyone who asked questions. Now, with the truth exposed, their attempt to pin it all on me only made the community angrier. As the investigation deepened, the city issued fines for environmental violations. The board faced legal consequences for misusing community funds and for failing to obtain the permits required for chemical treatments. Lawsuits piled up from residents demanding compensation for medical bills, property damage, and emotional distress. The once all-powerful HOA was collapsing under the weight of its own arrogance. And yet, as I sat on my porch overlooking the poisoned lake, I couldn't shake a strange emptiness. Yes, I had been vindicated. Yes, the board was finally being held accountable, but the lake was still dead. The water was still poisoned. My fishing spot, My peaceful retreat was gone, maybe forever. The damage they had done couldn't be undone with resignations or lawsuits. The ecosystem had been destroyed, and it would take years, maybe decades, to recover, if it ever did. That realization fueled something deeper in me. It wasn't enough to watch the board crumble. I wanted them ruined. I wanted them to feel the same loss, the same emptiness that they had inflicted on me and everyone else. So, while the lawsuits and investigations played out, I began planning my own form of revenge. Not through violence or destruction, but through exposure. I had the evidence. I had the documentation. And now, I had the attention of the media and the public. The HOA wanted to control me, to silence me, to make me conform. Instead, I was going to make them infamous. Their story wasn't just a neighborhood scandal anymore. It was a parable of greed, arrogance, and obsession gone too far. And I was going to make sure everyone knew it. The board thought the investigation was their worst nightmare. But they hadn't seen what was coming next. Because once the truth was out, there was no stopping the flood. I learned early on that stories go viral for two reasons: outrage and a face to attach it to. I had both. The outraged were easy: poisoned water, sick pets, broken promises, and the face was me, the guy who had refused to be silenced. The trick was packaging it in a way the internet couldn't ignore. So I did what every modern Avenger does. I turned the evidence into a narrative that could be shared in 5 seconds or 10 minutes, depending on how deep someone wanted to go. The dossier I'd been compiling for months was no longer a private archive. It became a weapon. Photographs lined up in chronological order told the story at a glance. The first slick on the water. The dead fish at the shoreline, screenshots of threatening HOA emails, the receipts and expense reports showing where our dues had really gone. Water sample jars sat on my porch, labeled and photographed beside a tape measure and a laboratory printout. I organized everything into neat folders: timeline, witnesses, financials, and medical reports. I wrote a simple, sharp summary that didn't mince words: facts, dates, names, and links to the proof. No conjecture, no melodrama, just the dossier and what it proved. Then I pushed it out into the world. A short video clip, 60 seconds of the worst images, set to a steady, undeniable beat, went up on social platforms. I narrated the arc of the folder in a single, steady voiceover, careful to keep it crisp and documentary-like. The clip was shareable. It had a hook. Within a day, it was everywhere. Neighbors shared it, then their friends, then strangers who had never been to our cul-de-sac. Comments flooded in: anger, disbelief, offers of legal help, people tagging local journalists. The story jumped from a neighborhood quarrel to a symbol of HOA overreach and environmental negligence. Reporters wanted more. Larger outlets wanted exclusive interviews and copies of the entire dossier. I sent everything I had, sanitized for public consumption but unflinching in detail. The narrative that emerged on the airwaves and in articles was perfect clickbait. A small, self-governed community poisoned by the very people who claimed to protect it. The adjectives were relentless, scandalous, negligent, criminal. The HOA's name trended alongside photos of the lake that could have been ripped from an environmental horror film. The board tried to fight back with press releases and legal threats, but the court of public opinion doesn't respond to corporate speak when the evidence is visual and visceral. People wanted accountability, not euphemisms. They wanted to know why community funds had been spent on secret chemical treatments and why the board had chosen intimidation over transparency. The narrative didn't allow for nuance. It demanded consequences. Outside the digital roar, the real-world reaction was swift and unmistakable. Protesters gathered at the community gates carrying signs turned from lawn stakes and poster board. The once pristine clubhouse, which had hosted polite wine and cheese social nights, was now a focal point of rage. Television crews filmed lines of residents, faces flushed with anger and exhaustion, telling the cameras exactly what the repository of evidence already said. They had been lied to. They had been poisoned, and they were done with the board. The pressure boiled over into legal action. Class action lawyers smelled the kind of systemic wrongdoing that pays dividends in the courthouse. Lawsuits were filed not only for the environmental damage but for fraudulent use of HOA funds and for the emotional distress suffered by families and individuals. The HOA's insurance carrier, which had once covered routine claims, began door-knocking its own counsel. The board that had once wielded power with a flick of a pen suddenly found itself with mounting legal bills and no allies. Social media, which had amplified the outrage, also amplified every misstep the board made thereafter. A fraudster's invoice posted to the wrong resident, an attempt to clarify a statement that read like a confession. Video footage of board members huddled at the maintenance shed with unmarked barrels, the same footage that had once terrified neighbors into silence, now became the centerpiece of national segments. The board members' names appeared in headlines and on screens in living rooms across the county. They had been right to be afraid. They had become famous for all the wrong reasons. Amid the chaos, I kept my focus narrow. Viral fame can be intoxicating, but my aim wasn't to be the neighborhood's temporary hero. It was to make the HOA pay and to force restoration of what had been destroyed. I used the attention to push the city and state environmental agencies into fast action, making sure they had the public support and the political incentive to treat the contamination as a priority. Regulatory pressure converged with citizen outrage. Temporary bottled water stations appeared at community centers. The health department issued formal advisories, and the city allocated emergency funding for initial remediation efforts. It felt surreal to watch bureaucratic wheels move at the speed of public fury. But the result was real: pumps, filtration systems, and the first attempts at restoring the aquifer were underway. Not everything unfolded cleanly. The HOA's counterattacks were vicious and petty. They sought injunctive relief to seal certain documents. They filed suit against me personally, alleging defamation and reckless dissemination of unverified claims. Their lawyers hinted at the possibility of distracted, expensive legal campaigns designed to wear me down. That was the old HOA playbook. Intimidate the whistleblower until they collapse under the weight of legal costs and social ostracism. It was calculated cruelty, but the strategy depended on obscuring the truth, and the truth was already public. The lawyers I'd been passing the dossier to had prepared responses. Pro bono legal teams, struck by the egregiousness of the board's conduct, stepped forward. Crowdfunding pages sprang up to cover legal fees for residents. Community members organized town halls and public document drives, demanding every receipt and email the board had ever touched. Transparency, once hard to pry loose, became the armor that protected us from the board's legal saber-rattling. The viral attention also brought unexpected support. Environmental advocacy groups offered resources and expert testimony. Local attorneys volunteered to represent affected residents. Former regulatory officials reached out with inside knowledge on building strong cases. Even academic researchers offered to study the contamination's long-term impact, turning our misfortune into a data point that could help other communities avoid the same fate. The story had grown teeth. It had become a movement about governance, accountability, and the right to clean water. Still, the emotional toll was heavy. Overnight, my inbox filled with messages from people I'd never met who wanted updates, advice, or simply to say thank you. I lived with that folder of jars and images, but I also lived with the knowledge that the lake might never be the same. The photo montages and headlines didn't capture the small, private losses. Afternoons of quiet line casting, the way the light used to hit the water at dusk, the soft chorus of frogs that no longer sang. The viral storm could topple a board and flood the airwaves, but it couldn't replace an ecosystem overnight. As the lawsuits multiplied and the remediation trucks arrived, the board's last bastions crumbled. Resignations followed. Criminal inquiries were whispered about. The people who had once controlled the neighborhood with petty rules and thinly veiled menace found themselves on the defensive, their reputations shredded by an army of outraged residents and a public that refused to forget. But the story was not yet finished. The spectacle had succeeded in bringing justice into motion and in exposing the sins that had festered behind manicured hedges. Yet the deeper fights, environmental restoration, long-term health monitoring, criminal investigations into deliberate contamination, were only beginning. Viral fame had opened doors, but it had not closed the case. And in the quiet moments, When the cameras were gone and the social feeds moved on to the next outrage, I sat by the lake and imagined the final chapter. I had made them famous. I had made them pay. Now it was time to make sure the aftermath would be lasting, and that the people who had been poisoned, literally and figuratively, would finally get the restitution they deserved. The last act began not with a bang, but with a slow, grinding cascade of paperwork and formalities that nevertheless carried the force of a gavel. Months of uproar, investigation, and viral fury funneled into court dockets, subpoenas, and sworn testimony. What once had been a neighborhood spat over backyard privileges had become a criminal and civil spectacle. Environmental crimes, fraud, misuse of communal funds, reckless endangerment. The legal machine doesn't move fast, but when it does move, institutions march in lockstep. Prosecutors, plaintiffs' attorneys, agency scientists, each step deliberate, each document a final brick in the case against those who'd thought themselves untouchable. The courtroom was a different kind of stage from the social feeds and morning news segments. Here, the layperson's outrage met the precision of evidence, chain of custody numbers and lab reports replacing hashtags and clips. The water sample jars from my porch were cataloged. The receipts and email chains that neighbors had whispered about in living rooms became exhibits. Expert witnesses explained in patient and terrible detail how the chemicals had altered the lake's ecology, how they had infiltrated irrigation lines and shallow wells, and what that meant for human health and the environment. The prose was dry, but the conclusions were furious. Deliberate application of hazardous treatments, failure to secure permits, gross negligence in administration. Board members who had once ruled meetings with clipped authority sat with faces gray under the courtroom lights. Their resignation letters, once waved like shields, were now little more than evidence of an attempt to duck responsibility. Some plead bargaining in hushed legalese. Others attempted to cast blame onto hired contractors. One volunteered a resignation that felt newly meaningless in the echo of the charges. The machine of accountability is not satisfied with contrition. It asks for restitution and, when called for, punishment. For the families who had tasted metallic water, for the gardeners whose plants had died, for the pets that got sick, and for the children whose parents now fretted over long-term exposure, restitution had to be more than words. Civil suits moved with the indignation of injured people. Class action claims consolidated with medical reports and invoices, vet bills, water filter replacements, water purchases, lost wages for parents who had to take time off to care for sick children. The HOA's insurance policies proved thinner than a lawn sprinkler's stream, and the personal liability of board members became a topic of lively interest. Financial penalties were assessed. Community funds were ordered to be redirected back into remediation and restitution. The legal verdicts did not erase what had been lost, but they did deliver the kind of tangible consequence that the board's previous Tea Party governance never imagined facing. Criminal consequences. When they arrived, were the bitterest medicine. Prosecutors sometimes favor negotiated pleas when the evidence is clear, but the community demanded a full accounting. For those whose emails and signatures showed direct authorization for the treatments, the charges were severe: environmental contamination, falsifying records, and in some cases, elder abuse. Because some of the sickest people had been the oldest residents, the ones least capable of advocating for themselves. The spectacle of citations and arraignments, of former neighbors escorted past each other in handcuffs, shredded more than reputations. It tore a hole through the neighborhood's social fabric, forcing people to reckon with how easily civility can mask cruelty. Meanwhile, remediation was not a single chapter with a neat ending. Restoration became an ugly, expensive, and slow science. Mechanical pumps ran for weeks, drawing contaminated water into treatment units. Filtration rigs and activated carbon beds replaced unwatched barbecues and community yoga sessions. The aquifer, patient and stubborn, refused quick fixes. Agencies modeled timelines in years, and researchers cautioned that biological recovery, from zooplankton to fish populations, could take multiple seasons of careful reseeding, habitat repair, and sustained water quality monitoring. There were victories along the way. Turbidity dropped in test wells, bacterial counts fell, and some wildlife returned in timid single-file glimpses. But the lake's old light, the particular gleam at dusk, the chorus of frogs that had once been a nightly lullaby, had a way of being conspicuously absent. Restoration funding came from many pockets: insurance claims, fines levied against board members, special assessments, and state emergency grants. The community learned the hard arithmetic that accompanies environmental repair: how many thousands to replace filtration systems, how many tens of thousands to regrade shorelines, how many hundreds to bring in certified aquatic biologists. Volunteers showed up in earnest. People who had fought bitterly in meeting rooms started working together on shoreline plantings, manual trash removal, and citizen water monitoring programs. The same voices that had leveled accusations now rolled up sleeves. It felt fragile and redemptive at once, a civic reconstruction project welded together by contrition and necessity. In quiet moments between court dates and remediation meetings, I realized the personal cost was heavier than I'd imagined. The viral fame I had once viewed as a tool had its own shadow. My privacy evaporated. My inbox filled with both support and vitriol. Friends and strangers sent legal advice and conspiracy theories with equal fervor. My house, once a sanctuary, became a touchstone in televised segments, a place where viewers imagined they could walk my yard and cast a line if they were so inclined. It was a strange life. Vindication came with a constant hum of attention. Even so, the deeper satisfaction came not from headlines, but from the community pivoting towards repair. I began co-chairing a citizens' restoration committee, a role I never asked for, but that the moment required. The committee coordinated volunteers, lobbied for monitoring grants, and hired independent auditors to ensure future transparency in HOA spending. There was an urgency to establishing checks and balances that had been glaringly absent, a desire to prevent future small tyrannies from morphing into catastrophes. The language around governance shifted from rules and aesthetics to accountability, environmental stewardship, and public health. There were softer reckonings, too. People who had been silent in the months of cover-up, neighbors who'd turned away at the meetings or forwarded HOA talking points, began showing up at cleanup days. Humble acts crystallized into a new communal ethic. The elderly woman who had refused to sue later brought hot coffee to volunteers. A former board member, stripped of title but not history, quietly donated a modest sum to help fund replacement filters for low-income households. These gestures did not erase the past, but they did complicate the narrative in useful ways. Remorse is messy and sometimes restorative, even if it cannot fully repair the harm done. The final legal outcomes were a mixture of punitive and restorative measures. Fines and restitution orders required the board to pay for a multi-year remediation plan. Several board members faced professional consequences and criminal penalties, while contractors implicated in poor practices faced fines and suspensions. A few individuals, judged to have been coerced or minimally involved, received lesser sanctions. The city instituted a new oversight protocol for neighborhood associations, requiring licensing for chemical applications and transparent financial reporting. It was the kind of regulatory tightening that governments conjure only after avoidable disasters. When the courts quieted and the remediation trucks reduced their rotations, the neighborhood settled into a new normal, scarred but altered. The lake was not the same, but it was healing in visible increments. Tadpoles returned in summer puddles. Migratory birds grazed briefly on refilled shallows. Green shoots clung to reclaimed banks. The real victory wasn't a single court verdict or viral headline. It was the slow rebuilding of trust, formalized through audits, meetings with clear minutes, and neighborhood charters that bound future boards to transparency. People were weary, but they were also wiser. On a late autumn morning, long after the last courtroom photo had run, I walked to the water's edge. The air had that brittle clarity that made small sounds seem important. I carried a single rod, but no real expectation of catching anything. The lake, healed in parts and scarred in others, looked less like a prize and more like a patient. I cast a line anyway. The act felt ceremonial. A small rebellion turned routine, a reclamation more personal than procedural. For a few minutes, the world narrowed to the rod, the line, and a distant ripple that could mean anything or nothing. The ripple resolved into the gentle tug of something small on the other end, a shiner, perhaps. A modest victory. It was enough. The story ended with no neat closure, only the accumulated consequence and a slow, deliberate attempt at repair. The HOA that poisoned our water no longer governed our lives. The people who had conspired to control others had been exposed, judged, and in many ways displaced. The neighborhood, flawed and stubborn, had survived. The lake would take seasons, perhaps years, to fully recover. But there, in the thin light, with the rod warm in my hands, I felt the first honest pulse of something like hope.